Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Or, to be more precise, this is going to be 30k lore. It's time that we start establishing some of the 30k universe, and the natural place to start would of course be the Unification Wars. Originally, I had some ideas around doing a lore video based entirely on the events of Old Night and the golden age of technology that went before it, now known as the Dark Age of technology, but we have so little information that can be relied upon about that particular period that I'll probably work that into a larger lore video on the Emperor himself, as he was most certainly bumping around even back then. And in fact, the reason why I'm doing this video is because I started writing the video about the Emperor and realized there's about a dozen subjects I have to cover before I can actually talk about the Big E himself. So, the Unification Wars. What were they? And perhaps equally importantly, which lore will I be using? Because this is a bit of an oddity, you see. Before we had the Horus Heresy series, we had very little information about 30k. Virtually nothing, in all due honesty. The Emperor was some amalgamation of dead human psykers or shamans, because back then psykers were not yet a quantified fact, so the lore then stating that there were supposedly thousands of them in old Earth, yet we have very little to no knowledge of them. In fact, psykers weren't really a known entity within human empire. The early human empire, that is, what was known as the early human federation of planets, wasn't even confirmed to be a thing before the 20th millennia, so there's a lot of self-contradictory stuff in the old lore, specifically because it was the old lore. It was very slapdash, as it was essentially just thrown together to be a mysterious backstory to the 41st millennium, rather than its own history. So I will mostly be using lore drawn from the various Horus Heresy books, which is far from complete, because, well, there's another 6 or 7 years left until the Horus Heresy series is done, but I don't have the fucking patience for that. And there are a few other lore inconsistencies that we will be running into when it comes to 30k lore, like the Primarchs, for example, but they'll get their own video soon enough. I hope, at least. Sometimes in the next 3 years. At the very least, sometimes during that time period. But I'll pick up on those various inconsistencies when I get to them and explain my reasoning behind it, so let's get back to the point of this video though, the Unification Wars. Now, you might think that the Unification Wars would be the name of the Emperor's campaign to unify Terra. This is in part true, but the Unification War period is a far lengthier period than the Emperor's own campaigns. You can kind of break them into two. There's the Age of Strife, which is everything from the collapse of the old human federation up until the Emperor taking power, that being then the era of the Great Crusades, and the Unification Wars. The Unification Wars took place somewhere between 27th millennium to 30th millennium, whereas the Age of Strife started somewhere around the 25th millennium and again lasted up until the Emperor took control sometime in the 31st millennium. Essentially, the Age of Strife involves the entirety of the ex-human federation, when it collapsed in upon itself due to various reasons at the beginning of the 25th millennium, whereas the Unification Wars refer specifically to the dozens upon dozens of armed conflicts that ravaged old Terra, up until the Emperor and his army of pet genetic monstrosities known as Thunder Warriors rolled out of hiding and subjugated everybody. Before that, though, Terra was divided into dozens of warring states, some of which were based on more or less the historical states we know today, like, for example, Germany, with a J, were based round about the area that modern-day Germany is in. The United States of America, is also, well, in America, and so on. Some of these states we have a fair bit of information on from the Old Lore and the Horus Heresy books, some we have virtually no information on, and some, a handful, we actually have fairly extensive knowledge about, usually from the Horus Heresy books taking place on Old Terra, or Earth, usually from the perspective of the Legio Custodes. But until Games Workshop goes out and releases a full-on sourcebook for the various factions and nations that existed back then, most of the information we have is a little bit sketchy, so take it all with a grain of salt. At least until either A, the Horus Heresy series ends, and we get a full picture, in which case I'll probably go through the entirety of the series once more and see if I find any major inconsistencies, or if Games Workshop starts releasing a series of background source books, which I really wish they would. I mean, just imagine a nice, big, fat Imperial Armor-sized book just detailing everything about the Unification Wars. Ooh, yes, please Games Workshop, make it fucking happen. Until then, though, the official explanation for why we have so little information about this particular period is that a lot of the knowledge has been lost over the years, which, considering all of the knowledge lost between 30th millennium to the 41st, that is a fairly reasonable excuse, and secondly, because the Imperium did like its good old-fashioned propaganda even back then, and, well, if you can simply say that every single other state in Old Terra was a bunch of techno-barbarian savages, then that makes the idea of the Imperium sound a lot sweeter indeed, does it not? In fact, there is some lovely wording from the official lore that states, and I'm quoting here, "This was a dark period for the people of Old Earth, when they were dominated by brutal rulers and despotic tyrants. It was against this backdrop of oppression, violence, and casual brutality that the Emperor of Mankind first revealed himself to the people of Terra." Goebbels would be fucking proud. First and foremost, it basically says that everyone was oppressed and had it terrible back then, and then the Emperor came and saved everyone, and replaced the old oppressive, brutal, and violently non-democratic regime with another violently undemocratic, oppressive, and brutal regime. As you can see, the two are entirely different. I do love a bit of old spin. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Old Terra was a bloody rose garden before the coming of the Emperor. Quite on the contrary, in fact. It was an absolute hellhole, with the various tribes and nation-states fighting tooth, nail, claw, nuclear, and biological against each other, blasting the landscape with radiation, various poisons, and generally being a right proper bunch of douchebags to the civilian population. And the Emperor taking over the entirety of the planet improved most people's lives, if for no other reason than the simple fact that they no longer had nukes dropped on their heads at regular intervals. Because, of course, it wasn't enough that the world was now populated entirely by various barbarous states that primarily conducted their diplomacy at the end of heavy blunt objects, they also had access to all kinds of very, very powerful technology from the Golden Age of Tech, or, as it was now known, the Dark Age of Technology, including, as I mentioned, chemical and biological weapons along with nuclear weapons, and other things like automatic weapons, plasma guns, heavy artillery, etc. You know, the kind of shit that makes battles a little bit more interesting for those involved in it. And as an added bonus, the bigger the bang, the better the chance of getting in some bonus points with some collateral damage. Say what you will about Earth's Dark Ages, at least back then we were firing at each other with trebuchets and catapults at the worst, and maybe some severed cowheads. The Reunification Wars were pretty much like that when it came to brutality and savagery, except there were way more people around, therefore way more people to kill, and they were lugging around stuff like plasma guns, flamethrowers, tactical nukes, tactical bombers, heavy artillery, tanks, etc. And due to this rather peculiar mix of extreme savagery, brutalism, and highly technological firepower, the various states, nations, confederations, or even individual city-states, etc., were all known as techno-barbarians. However, it does seem relatively likely that the one that came up with the common name of techno-barbarians was someone in the Emperor's employ, seeing as it is a wonderful name to kind of sweepingly generalize all of the other nations as barbarians, as savages, you know. As we will come to see a bit later, some of these nation-states were actually fairly organized and were relatively civilized, or at least as civilized as you can get when you are surrounded on all sides by enemies, because there were plenty of proper techno-barbarians as well. Nation-states that gave pretty much no fucks whatsoever in anything except their own interests, and, well, those interests usually involved murder-fucking the shit out of anything that got within 100 yards. So let's take a look at some of these various techno-barbarian states, shall we? Starting with the Achaemenid Empire of Southwest Asia. This miniature empire was located round about the area of where Persia would have been in our old history, and was not so much a single nation-state as it was a loose confederacy of various wealthy tribes. Most of these tribes, very early on, made the fairly wise decision to not fight the big-ass motherfucker in the golden plate armor leading an army of superhumans, and rather decided to align themselves with the rising empire of man early on in the Emperor's conquests, thereby avoiding the unpleasantness of getting invaded by an army of batshit insane thunder warriors. As an added bonus, this area had gotten out of the Unification Wars relatively unscathed, which is a bit of an irony considering the hotbed of conflict that it has been for pretty much as long as there has been humans in our own history. In the Unification Wars, it avoided the majority of the conflicts, leaving the people there unscarred by various nuclear and biological warfare methods, which meant that many of the people living in this area were of a purer human genome than various other races who had been contaminated by biological, or chemical, or nuclear warfare. This relative purity made them excellent candidates for recruitment into the Adeptus Astartes Legion after the Unification Wars. Then we have Albia, or Albanian, sometimes called Old Albion. Now, this one is a little bit of an interesting one, because it says that it was located somewhere near the borders of the Northern Atlan, which is the name for the Northern Atlantic Ocean, which at this point had essentially entirely dried up during the various nuclear wars and stuff, had vaporized most of the water. Which is a little bit odd, because it is known mostly for its various border skirmishes and grievances with the Pan-Pacific Empire, which, assuming these guys are indeed bordering the Northern Atlantic, that would put them on the opposite side of the world, essentially, from the Pan-Pacific Empire, which was naturally located in and around the Pacific, around Japan, Korea, and Australia, in that area. It is possible that they might have been around the region of Panama, for example, but even that feels like a little bit of a stretch, but possibly. Regardless, this particular nation was actually an ally of the Imperium of Man for quite some time, while they were both fighting the Pan-Pacific Empire. Eventually, however, time came for the Emperor to take over Albia as well, and the people there were none too keen at bending a knee even to this former ally. And the people of Albia had been able to keep a hold of quite a lot of technology from Old Night, and were able to face the Thunder Warriors in the field with their own power-armoured troops, as well as proto-dreadnoughts and all manners of nasties. The war ground on, with no clear victor in sight, until the Emperor used some of his diplomatic know-how to call a bit of a powwow with the various leaders of Albia. Once they met the Emperor face to face, he somehow managed to convince them that he was not like the tyrants of previous ages, and after that they quite happily subjected themselves to his rule. Impressed by their warrior spirit, the Emperor forgave them and let them join the Empire without any further bloodshed. This proved to be a wise move, as the people of Albia became staunch supporters of the Empire, and provided much of the initial recruiting stock for the 14th Legion Astartes, then known as the Dusk Raiders, later known as the Death Guard. Then we have Albion, not to be confused with the recent Albia. Albion was, well, the British Isles, as the name kind of suggests. We have less information about this area. All we really know is that the Emperor invaded it to overthrow the tyrannical rule of Ulium the Red, a rather fanciful fella that had a nasty habit of eating his subjects and drinking their blood. He was thrown into the rather considerably sized imperial dungeon of Kangaba Marvu in the Himalayas, a massive prison complex built specifically to house the more problematic inhabitants of the burgeoning Imperium. Something like, especially powerful psykers, crazy dictators, or later on, Adeptus Astartes. But the Emperor wasn't always a hard-ass. In fact, he could be downright reasonable and even somewhat gentle, as long as it didn't cost him anything. The nation of Boeotia is a wonderful example of this. This was a relatively wealthy and relatively small area with a heavy concentration of industry. Boeotia had for a very long period of time already recognized the Imperium's supremacy over Terra. Essentially, for the last 150-odd years, they had said, yeah, we're going to join the Imperium, but we need to check out some things first. I need to run this by my accountant, I need to ask my wife. My wife is out at the moment, she has a headache, can't ask her now. Maybe next week. Oh, and by the way, I have to ask my plumber and my rabbi and blah-blah-blah for 150 fucking years, until finally the Emperor got sick of this nonsense and invaded the place with the Imperial Army and the Thousand Sun Space Marine Legion, which crushed the rebellious state in a matter of days. Not Big E's fault, naturally. He had been a very, very patient demigod, but you can only push the embodiment of humanity so long before he starts getting a bit impatient. And when the Emperor gets impatient, shit gets real dangerous real fast. Such leniency was not always possible, although the Emperor tried to convince most of the people of Terra to join him through diplomatic means, if for no other reason than it was a hell of a lot cheaper and easier to talk someone into joining you rather than invading them with a very large and relatively expensive army of Thunder Warriors. And the Emperor was a pretty damn good propagandist as well. He managed to overthrow several smaller nations simply just by his image as the savior of humanity. One of the nations overthrown and later integrated into the Imperium in this manner was the Indonesia Block, located somewhere around the area of modern-day Indonesia. This particular area of Terra was ran by a tyrannical ethnarch, the head of a rather fascinating little church, who had figured that humanity's woes all came down to technology. We were a little bit too much of an upstart species. We had to limit our technological pursuits and seek back to a more pure age. This would be achieved by, first and foremost, taking care of all of that pesky technology, preferably by burning it and anyone who invented it. As such, scientists and mathematicians were burned on massive bonfires right alongside their theories and their machines. The tyrant Etranarch also sought to purify the human species by forced breeding programs, where only those suitable were allowed to have children, and those people judged to be undesirable were either sterilized if the local government was feeling particularly kind and generous that particular day, or just flat out murdered if they felt a little bit more aggressive. Unsurprisingly, this tyrannical regime was not particularly popular amongst the peasantry, and they revolted against the administration and rejoined the empire after disposing of the tyrannical despot. Through a remarkable show of self-constraint, the tyrant was not outright murdered by the hordes of people banging at his door, and was indeed sent to a prison colony where, well, it didn't take long before the prisoners found out who he was and ripped him piece from piece, but still, pretty damn remarkable act of restraint, not simply have murdered him in the first place. It would take quite a while yet before the Indonesia Block was fully integrated into the burgeoning Imperium of Man, but from this point onwards they were essentially a staunch ally of the Emperor. But of course, not all conquests would prove quite this simple. One of the examples of this, for a less than entirely obvious reason, was Urush. Now, Urush was the largest and most powerful of the techno-barbarian empires on Terra before the Emperor started showing some muscle. It consisted of pretty much all of modern-day Russia, along with considerable parts of Asia and possibly parts of China. Now, Urush was not as technologically advanced as many other of the nations around at the time, but it was absolutely gargantuan and had a massive population available to it. It is important to remember that back at this time, hive cities were quite common already on Terra. They would become a hell of a lot more common over the course of the Imperium's growth, but already billions upon billions upon billions of people would call these hive cities home. And while at first it might seem that this would be a fairly natural thing for them to do, to resist the Imperium, I mean, however, it's not just the simple fact that this was a large empire, and therefore would be rather unwilling to bend a knee to some upstart emperor. There are also fairly significant hints suggesting that Urush was, if not entirely under the direct control of the forces of the Ruinous Powers, then at the very least the leaders of Urush were heavily influenced by the war. They were, amongst other things, known to use what the Chronicles of Urush called magic, which in all due likelihood was the psychic powers of various powerful psyches. In fact, the people of Urush themselves referred to these powerful psyches as wrath singers. The question, in all due reality, then becomes, were they simply just using the warp, as many other nations would have done, as a form of sorcery? Essentially, the human population would be using the warp and considering it to be magic, basically. They would not understand from whence it came, they would certainly not understand what or who the Ruinous Powers were, because they had no idea that they were using Chaos powers. As far as they were concerned, their abilities were simply just magical. Or did the people of Urush know a little bit more about where this power came from? Well, seeing as the Emperor did not wipe the people of Urush off the map, we can relatively surely assume that the people themselves were at the very least not directly worshipping the Ruinous Powers. It is unclear whether or not the higher echelons of Urush command were, however. All of Urush's leadership were warlords of one stripe or another. You simply could not rise to the top of Urushian society without being the leader of a reputable warband, since it was a very, very brutal society that valued strength and brutality above pretty much anything. Now, this does sound like a society that Khorne would most definitively approve of, but again, there are no signs of overt chaos corruption. We're not talking about mutated people here with horns or anything, but then again, the powers of chaos were at a relatively low ebb during this period of history. So it is entirely possible that the people of Urush were affected by the chaotic deities, but not in such a way that it was immediately visible, shall we say, not overtly affected. They were just beginning to be slowly affected by the powers of chaos, which might also explain why the extremely, relatively speaking, peaceful nation of Urush decided to declare war on not just anyone like the Pan-Pacific Empire, but one of their closest trading partners, the Nord Africa Conclaves, which seems like a highly irrational decision, but it would definitely be something that someone influenced by Khorne would think of doing. Again, we can't be entirely sure either way, but seeing as the nation of Urush was invaded by the Empire, and they didn't wipe out every single last man, woman, and child, we can be fairly certain that if there were chaos corruption in Urush, it was relatively limited. And make no mistake, the reason why the people of Urush were not wiped out were not because the Emperor was somehow a little bit of a softy and valued human life. Oh, absolutely not. Let me tell you the story of the hive city of Oreok. Oreok was a considerably sized hive city located inside a hollowed-out glacier, located somewhere in the South Pole. This, to put it mildly, isolated position meant that its people had not suffered anywhere near as much as most during the Age of Strife, and due to this, they began to consider themselves to be just a little bit special. They considered themselves to be the chosen people, protected by an unknown pantheon of gods, hailing back to Terra's pre-Federation times. The Emperor, as we all know at this point, was not particularly fond of religion, and he couldn't just leave a major hive city like that located there, because he had plans for the southern ice caps, big plans, and they did not involve the people of Oreok. And what do you send to chastise a zealot? Why, an army of superpowered zealots, obviously. The Emperor dispatched the 17th Legion, then known as the Imperial Heralds, later to be known as the Word Bearers, to pacify the people of Oreok. With their usual zeal, the Imperial Heralds gave the people of Oreok a very simple ultimatum. They would bend to the Emperor's will, or they would all burn. The religious leadership of Oreok, however, did not give the Imperial Heralds a chance to even present their ultimatum, as they shot down their transport while it was inbound to the city. Unsurprisingly, the Imperial Heralds did not take this as a show of good faith, and promptly invaded the city. Oreok, being a hive city, of course, had a fair bit of defences, but it had never been tested the way that many hive cities on Terra had. As such, the defences were woefully inadequate to stop a proto-legion of Adeptus Astartes. Small though it may have been at this time, it was overwhelming force compared to the defences of Oreok. Within 3 hours, the city's defences had all been neutralised. The city was essentially in the Imperial Herald's hands. What remained of the civilian population had all been herded into the lower civilian levels, and possessed, in all due honesty, absolutely no threat whatsoever to the Adeptus Astartes. However, the Imperial Heralds had made their ultimatum. Whether or not it had been heard was entirely inconsequential. Once the last of the civilian population was confirmed to have entered the depths of the city, the Heralds simply blew the city to Kingdom Come, detonating its plasma reactors and flooding what was left of the city in plasma. It is impossible to estimate how many people would have lived in this city, but it would almost certainly be in the high millions to the low billions, all murdered in the space of 3 hours. Simply because they refused to bend the knee. The Emperor could be merciful. In fact, on several occasions he was extremely merciful. He was more than willing to explore diplomatic options to resolve the various conflicts of interest that his overall leadership would inevitably create. For example, as in the case of Brazil, a powerful techno-barbarian state centered in the area around what is modern-day Brazil. This nation was defeated by the Emperor's forces in the field, but having a long and proud history, Brazil was allowed to retain some of its independence, including its own independent police force and its own army, known as the Dracos. However, he was also under absolutely no illusions whatsoever that to rule the entirety of humanity required a stern hand, and occasionally a merciless one. And the people of Oreok and the people of Voniri served excellently as examples of just this. As for Voniri, by the way, that is something I'm going to be saving for the Night Lords video. Suffice to say, it was a rebellious movement created on Old Earth after the Emperor had left the planet to pursue his goals in the galaxy. He understood, however, that internal strife on Terra could not be accepted, and as such, he resolved the rebellion, led by a group calling themselves the Crimson Walkers, by uttering one simple sentence: "Send in the 8th." The Crimson Walker rebellion was quashed by the next morning. This all makes the Unification Wars sound somewhat simple, though. It's been mostly cakewalks for the Imperial forces so far, hasn't it? Well, not really. The thing is, most of these campaigns are fairly low on details. In fact, we know virtually nothing about most of them. As such, I can pretty much only tell you the outcome, and that inevitably ends in Imperial victory because, they took over the planet and stuff. The only campaign we have proper detailed knowledge of is the campaign into the Caucasus Wastes, carried out by the 18th Legion, later to be known as the Salamanders, and that epic confrontation is going in the Salamanders lore video. Suffice to say, 20,000 Salamanders went in, only 1,000 came back out again. The last battle of the Unification Wars took place at Mount Ararat against the Techno-Barbarian state of Urartu. The Techno-Barbarian forces were heavily fortified all the way up the mountains, and during the resulting conflict, the last of the Emperor's Thunder Warriors were all slain to a man while reaching the summit. The legendary Thunder Warrior, Arik Taranis, known as the Lightning Bearer, was the last man alive that reached the summit and planted the Lightning Banner on top of Mount Arat, signaling the end of the Unification Wars. With this last heroic action, the Thunder Warriors finally united Terra beneath the Lightning Banner of the Emperor. Or so, at least, the story goes. In reality, we now know that the Lightning Bearer survived the battle. And not only did he survive the battle against the Urartu, he survived the subsequent culling of the Thunder Warriors. You see, the Thunder Warriors were not wiped out by the Urartu. The last remaining Thunder Warriors were culled, presumably by the Legio Custodes, as they were the only fighting force at the time not only capable of matching the Thunder Warriors in battle, but also that could be relied upon 100% to never again speak of that action. The Emperor needed to get rid of the Thunder Warriors, as they were never meant to last for as long as they did. Their genetic makeup was meant to self-destruct, except the Emperor was too darn good at his job, and it didn't go quite the way he had planned. On the other hand, the Thunder Warriors were dangerously unstable. They were brutish creatures, extremely violent creatures. They were not the soldiers the Emperor needed to conquer and then, more importantly, pacify and police the galaxy. And what better final use of the Thunder Warriors than have them all die to the last man in one last glorious actions, to buy the very unification that they had sought so long to achieve with the final drop of their blood. What warrior culture could ask for a more glorious ending? And so, the Unification Wars came to an end. Even after the Unification Wars, there were still considerable amounts of unrest on Holy Terra. There was many uprisings, there were several rebellions, but they were never ever again a true threat to the Emperor's domain over Terra. The closest they ever came were the Crimson Walkers, and the 8th took care of them. Most rebellions were extremely local in nature, covering very small parts of Terra, and usually amounting to no more than 40,000–50,000 men, tops, poorly armed and poorly trained militia. Usually repressed by local Imperial Army forces without the need to call in the Adeptus Astartes or the Legio Custodes. Speaking of the Legio Custodes, they took on the role as Guardians of Terra, both in an outright and overt military capacity, and they also served as a form of secret police force, hunting down rebellious elements before they were able to organize, and euthanizing certain problematic political and religious figures before they could gain any real traction. Tasks such as these were later on delegated to other various imperial officers, like the Officio Assassinarium and the Adeptus Arbites. But for now, after several thousand years of near-constant warfare between the various techno-barbarian tribes, between various city-states, hive cities, and nations, the planet of Terra was finally united underneath one single banner, namely that of the Emperor. The age of strife had passed. Now we entered into the age of the Great Crusade. And that will have to be a topic for another day. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.